Hello and welcome back to the Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage. This is part 3. Today we've finally reached Rhoscrowther. That is the huge oil refinery that I've been pointing out along the way. And just to my right, you can see down in the valley, Rhoscrowther Church, St Decumanus or St Decuman. As you can see, it's a pretty surreal location for a church. Obviously the church was here before the oil refinery. The oil refinery was opened in the 1960s. It's a Texaco oil refinery. Well, it was then, I don't know if it is now. And it feeds not only obviously petrol supplies for Britain, but also Europe's largest oil powered power station. But St Decumanus Church is a real true survivor, you could call it, as in 1994 there was a huge explosion at the oil refinery which damaged loads of windows, and St Decumanus has been with the Friends of Friendless Churches since 2005, as just before the oil refinery explosion the oil refinery offered to buy up the rest of the village so that they wouldn't have to perhaps worry about explosions, or just to expand their site. So there's only a very few houses and farms left in the vicinity of what was once the village of Rhoscrowther. So it stands all alone in this really bizarre environment, but as you can see, it has a surreality to its beauty. I find the towers of the oil refinery to be like a sort of glowing city on the hill, although it's sort of dystopian. So here we are at Rhoscrowther Church. It's dedicated to St Decumanus, who was a 7th century noble from round here, and wishing to fulfill his desire for a religious life, left Wales, got in a little coracle. That's one of these round boats. We have another one of those at a Friends of Friendless Church. I'll put the name in here. He crossed the Severn Channel in that boat, landed in Watchet in Somerset, and was then in 706 AD, had his head cut off by an angry pagan, martyred, killed. His head was brought back here, and I believe that's when the church was founded, although there's no hard evidence of that. But yes, a cult around St Decumanus was established here, and we'll see his shrine inside. You come down the valley and you pass the old schoolhouse, and then you come up and you're greeted by the huge 14th century tower. It's not as tall and tapered as the ones we've seen elsewhere. I quite like this church tower. So Rhoscrowther Church has an incredibly large porch. It has these beautiful pebbled floors. This font, you usually don't find fonts in porches, but that's because this font isn't from here. It's actually from the neighbouring parish, Pwllcrochan. The church there was closed in the 1980s, and that's because of the expansion of the oil refinery, which we've already sort of covered. But yes, it wasn't the only feature to come from Pwllcrochan Church. On the wall there is also a tablet, a memorial from the 18th century in the Baroque style with cherubs and urns and all that. That commemorates the Pow family. They're a large noble family, gentry family, around here. And they were involved in the siege of Pembroke Castle. They sort of stood up against the parliamentarians when the whole debate about the arrears. A lovely gentleman who cares for the church, he gave me a tour around. He told me this piece of information. But he was giving me such a lovely tour. We also have here in the porch above the door another feature, which is not native to this church, you could say. It's from Angle, not Pwllcrochan. Angle Church still open, but in the 19th century these churches were restored by, I believe, the same architect, and he brought this carving. I think they said it's 14th century, 13th century, a medieval carving, and it depicts Christ in majesty. He's depicted sat on a seat with his hands in the air. It's a bit of a strange depiction. So here at the western end of the church you have that 18th century wall tablet from Pwllcrochan, but you've also got the 2 Decalogue boards. And I'm not sure if this is true, but it's worth adding in anyway. But the man told me, it would make sense if it's true, that in the 10th commandment it says, thou shalt not covet your neighbour's house and all this. It also says you shall not covet your neighbour's servant. And that's because he says that the local gentry families, where their sons were getting their business with the servant girls, and so they had to install this specifically to, dampen those urges, if you will. So then we have the shrine of St Decumanus. It's not here anymore because, of course, like all shrines, it was destroyed during the 16th century Reformation. But what we have is the base of the shrine. You've got this gorgeous, quatrefoil decoration on it. It's believed it dates to the 15th century. Probably a rebuild. There's probably been a shrine here as long as there's been a church here, probably. Well, not quite, but about. And so yes, this north transept was probably built specifically for the shrine of St Ecumanus. But then obviously that was destroyed, and it seems from the 2 stone tablets that the Griffiths family used that as their sort of personal mausoleum, if you will. Not that they had any grand monuments like you'd see perhaps in England. They're just 2 rather plain, although quite interesting 18th century ledger stones. And then you've got in the 19th century the installation, I think it's 19th century, it could be early 20th, but it's an organ. It's quite a large organ for the size of the church, and the gentleman who showed me round said that it was one of only 2 in the country because of its wooden pipes. It's got lead pipes at the front and wooden pipes behind, which apparently is quite rare. I know nothing about organs really, but that is a special one apparently, although quite a different one to the one we saw yesterday in episode 2 at, where was that? That was Warren Church, Mendelssohn's organ, very different to this one. What was really interesting about being shown round by a local or someone who's very intimately connected to the church is the things that I wouldn't particularly take note of, not bother him, but intrigue him greatly. So for one is the incredible amount of places to put a Bible. I think we counted about 6 of them in just this area of the church. Obviously that's nothing particular, but perhaps it shows the preferences of whoever was the local curate here, vicar in the 19th century. Another thing that sort of baffled that chap was the arch here. So this obviously is an arch which perhaps would have had an effigy underneath it. I was thinking maybe an Easter sepulchre, but I didn't mention it because I didn't want to confuse things, but it could well be an Easter sepulchre. It has a green man, or what I think is a green man at the top. It's probably 14th century. It sort of looks to be like the decorated Gothic style. But it has been obviously bricked up in centuries since. Also interesting that he noted was this Skinner wall monument here from the 18th century, very late 18th century. He died near this spot, so whether that meant he died in the estuary just nearby or was taken home and then died, who knows? But it's quite an interesting little note, and I probably wouldn't have paid attention to that monument if he hadn't raised it up. So it's always worth, that's the thing with churches, there's so much to see that you often, forget the little things. So here we have the Lady Chapel, built to the adjacent side of the chancel. In it we have these 2 slightly more simple arches. Beneath one of them we have a female effigy, which he mentioned being from the time of Henry VIII, although from my understanding of sculpted effigies, it probably dates to the medieval period, or maybe the 14th century would make sense with the rest of the building. He said that they had people who came here who had devices on their phones that allowed them to talk to ghosts. So they asked her what her name was, and she responded with Alexandra. Then they asked whether or not she had any relatives still around here, or if she was related to the people around here. And apparently then the door of the church slammed, so they took that as a no. Quite an interesting little story that you don't usually, I wouldn't know that if I didn't have him show me around. Then in this corner of the Lady Chapel, we have 2 Celtic-looking slabs. Then on the wall above, we have a small 18th century tablet, very cracked, badly damaged. Also, there's a whole crack going along the wall there. That's not great. That seems to have damaged the thing. And he was saying, I think, that adding the tower, they believe, pushed the weight of these walls out, and so there is a buttress that runs between these 2 windows. But anyway, that tablet he raised because it has the word happy written on it. It says, immortal happy. And I said I have come across that before because that's a great example of what my dissertation was about, which was about the 17th century, although this is 18th century, predominantly 17th century. These ideas that no longer being scared of death like you were in the medieval period because you don't have to face purgatory anymore. And finally, a little gem from that man was the story about when he came here one day, October 2020, I think he said it was, and he found there was all clothes all over the pews here in the nave. And then he walked up, and there was a man lying asleep, apparently naked, except for wearing a hat, on the altar. Well, not the altar, but probably the steps before it. And he said, what is going on here? And the man had been walking out and got caught in the rain and just slept here overnight, to dry and had all his clothes off to dry. So he says, you know, that you wouldn't expect to find a naked man in the church, you know. But then, even stranger, as they're walking out, what turns up? A school bus full of children coming here on a school trip. And he was saying, can you imagine it if those children turned up and found a naked man on the altar or near the altar? They would say, ah, Jesus has arisen, which I thought was quite a good little funny anecdote. You know, you don't get that if you just come here and there's no one here. That's why, you know, it's all about, you know, this pilgrimage, this journey. It's all about characters you meet along the way, as well as the beautiful buildings we're taking in. So I guess the oil refinery is sort of a physical statement of the idea that the price we pay for modernity is the desecration of both history and nature. I predict people will say, oh, why did the British let, you know, massive multinational American oil company build a huge oil refinery, blighting the landscape, I should say, blighting the landscape down here in Wales. Well, the simple reason is money. Not simple money, well, it is simple money. One reason is money, the other is necessity. You know, we all need petrol, like it or not, which we definitely did in the 1950s and 60s when this was being set up. So it's a shame because obviously it's caused, you know, two medieval churches to be completely, utterly lose their historical character and fabric. Thankfully, the Friends of Friendless Churches have saved Rhoscrowther. But, and also obviously the natural beauty of this part of South Wales is lovely. And, you know, this is a bit of an eyesore, but as I say, it's a necessity as well as something that is, you know, financially advantageous to the area. So I thought I'd take a bit of a shortcut through one of the fields. I've ended up in this little wooded oasis. It's quite difficult getting through here, but this will mean we'll get to Pwllcrochan a lot quicker. Okay, I wouldn't recommend doing this because I'm now currently in a ditch filled with stinging nettles and brambles, and I am prickled to pieces. But this is obviously where the animals cross, so I'm going to cross the river here. Well, I made it out of there alive, only a few stinging nettles. All I can say is that barbed wire does a bloody good job. My trousers have now got holes in them. I don't know if you can actually see that, but my trousers have got holes in them. Now, I wish I'd just kept walking on the main road probably. That was quite interesting, made the journey a little bit more interesting. And as you can see in front of me, there is the church. So that was, you know, maybe a shortcut. More oiled stuff on the other side of the river, yeah, to the church. After squeezing through a hedge, thankfully there was a tree allowing me to jump over the nettles. I've made it to the road on which Pwllcrochan Church is on. That was quite an ordeal, and I don't think it probably saved us any time. Maybe saved us a little bit of walking, but definitely not any time. Again, another lovely road. Let's go and see the church now. I think it's got there's a bus here. So maybe, because I could see people down by what looked like a nature reserve. So maybe there is a nature reserve there, or an abandoned house. Yes, so it's a nature reserve that seems to use the church as its, like, you know, offices or base or whatever. Study session, I don't know what you'd call it. Study space, maybe. Because there's loads of kids there, a whole school bus, as I said. And it did say, unfortunately, on the door, said private school session in operational something. And so I didn't want to put my head in because that would be disrespectful, but it does seem basically like this church was largely stripped, also heavily Victorianised. But there was some original furnishings in there. Nice roof as well. But no, I didn't look in. But it's worth knowing that it's no longer a private house. It actually looks really well looked after. Really well looked after. Which is great to hear, really. So, leaving Pwllcrochan now, we have to head about 7 or 8 kilometres to Pembroke. And after a short montage, I'll see you again at Monkton Priory. So we finally made it to Pembroke, well, almost Pembroke. This is Monkton, just outside across the river, known as Monkton because of the priory of which the graveyard I'm standing in. The priory was founded here in the end of the 11th century, I believe, by Arnulf, the conqueror of Wales, or this part of Wales to be precise. The priory was dissolved in 1539, so it existed for more than half a millennia. Monkton gets its name from Monk Town. The priory was about the same size, the priory church is about the same size as what remains, but the original priory included many, many domestic buildings all around the vicinity of the church. A bit like Castle Martin from the previous episode, there are interesting things here before we even enter the church. So this is the huge porch to the church, and it's an original either, I believe it probably to be original, because of the particular weathering and style of these two posts here at the front arch. This is indication of Norman work, so probably the 12th century. But it's a huge porch, which makes me think, oh, maybe the Victorians extended it. But I do believe it to be original. And that's, I think, corroborated by what it says inside. What it does say inside is that, and what I suspected when I first walked into this room, if you will, is that there was a little room above the porch. You can see the doorway there leading to this room above the porch. Often these were preserved for, you know, maybe the vicar would sleep there occasionally, or maybe they were used for educating or any variety of purposes. Apparently when the Victorians took the floor out, well, I assume it was the Victorians, it didn't say, but in the little leaflet it said that they found a body of a monk still up there. I doubt that was a monk. Maybe it was someone from maybe 100 years ago or however long, and their body had completely decomposed. But apparently the way that the body was, as if they'd been locked in there, as if they were left to die, which is quite horrific. But it's quite interesting to see these. You get these in some churches, but never this big. I haven't seen one this big ever before. So here we are inside the church, and as you can see, it's incredibly long. As I said, this is about the size of the medieval church, but when Henry VIII had the priory demolished in 1539, the eastern end of the church was knocked down. And so if you'd been here in any time between the 16th and 19th centuries, you would have only seen the church extend as far as the great big chancel arch. The church would have extended no further east than there, being bricked up and being a ruin beyond. And of course, in the medieval church, this is probably a transept. The large arch here would have extended that way, just like it does on this side. However, that was of course demolished and bricked up at the Reformation during the dissolution, but it's not all doom and gloom, because that means that we have these gorgeous 17th century funerary monuments. For those of you who are following along with this Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage series, then you perhaps will think this looks awfully familiar, as it's fairly identical to the Stackpole monument, the Lort family monument in Stackpole Church. It's the same sort of sandstone, and again, I have no hard evidence for it, but my gut instinct is to say this was imported from the West Country, as it's very similar to some of the monuments we see down that part of the world. It's slightly cruder than the alabaster or marble monuments you'd find in east and southeast of England. It's a particular vernacular. This other monument on this blocked up transept wall, I believe to date slightly later. I'd guess that's early 17th century, like the Lort monument at Stackpole. But this one, I would put at probably the second half of the 17th century. We're looking at, you know, the period of King Charles II, probably. I'd say that because of this particularly, you know, over-the-top floral ornamentation, sort of edging towards the Baroque in style. Also these huge crying cherubs. This one actually has a teardrop coming from its eye. Their hands clearly broken. I assume this one may have been holding a trumpet. The final of the 4 post-Reformation monuments here at Monkton is this curious thing in the transept beneath the large 15th century tower. So I think what we've got going on here is 3 separate monuments that have been all converged into one. However, that's purely my speculation, and the information inside the church doesn't give any information about these monuments. So let's take it from the bottom up. The bottom is this chest tomb made of sandstone, not the same sandstone as the monument over there, but it does have, and it's very typical for the period, to have the kneeling children of whoever it commemorates. Again, these people in early 17th century style with ruffs and rather flowing dresses. I assume they're all supposed to be the women, the children of whoever this commemorates. And on this side, an armorial cartouche. Then we have this large black altar stone. Now, the church in here have put candles and a cross on it as if it is an altar, which makes me think maybe in the 19th century or maybe even the 20th century, they put this on top of here. This could be a medieval altar, although I'm struggling to find any anointment crosses. Then on top of this, at the back here, we have what looks to be alabaster, sort of wall segment that's completely out of fitting with the two lower parts and is badly damaged, commemorating a Sir Francis Mayrick, who was the son of the Bishop of Bangor in North Wales. So a fairly notable individual, although for me the two bits don't go together, as number one, they're different stones and you wouldn't really make them out of different stones. As you see, the monument on the other side of the church here is all made of the same stone, although there is an argument to say that perhaps it is all one piece, but this would be a highly unusual piece. Although I guess you could further look to evidence of it being one piece as being the same stone is used for the inscription and for this altar. But it's just the way it's such a jarring combination, which is really unlike any monument I've ever really seen before. So this is quite exciting, really. Oh, you've also got this armorial cartouche above. Does that match with this armorial cartouche? No, it doesn't seem to match with that one. So that's even more curious. In the late 19th century, the Victorians rebuilt the eastern half of the Priory Church, creating this enormous chancel. I mean, it really is big. Apparently, this roof is like 65 feet high and 45 feet wide, I think, the chancel here. Obviously, it's not just a chancel, it's a choir too. So you've got these really ornate Gothic revival, if you will, choir stalls extending. And then right in the eastern half of the church, you've got a great mix of the Victorian and the medieval. So up here next to the high altar is what looks to be a late medieval Easter sepulchre tomb. So you can see in the incised bit, there are the ghostly remains of the brasses that commemorate whoever this individual was, who is buried or was buried underneath here. It's in a typical style. This is actually very similar to one I've seen in Blythburgh in Suffolk. So literally, we're here on the west coast of Britain. That's literally on the east coast of Britain. It looks incredibly similar. It's like perpendicular Gothic in its style, with quatrefoils, with shields in the middle of them. It's very similar. Even the stone's similar. So maybe, I don't know if they were mass producing, if we can use that word, in the 15th century, these sort of Easter sepulchres, but it's incredibly similar. That's quite uncanny, actually. Then in this shallow little recess here, we have a very worn effigy of a monk or a knight, but I think a monk. Apparently, it might have been this one, it could have been another one. There is another effigy, but even more worn in the chancel here, that they found underneath the doorstep when they were redoing the floors in the 19th century. So that's an example of, in the Reformation, them reusing, it could even be before the Reformation, reusing bits of church furnishings that should be treated with respect and honour, but have actually been desecrated even in centuries before, the Victorians got their hands and started messing up with all the medieval stuff. Talking the Victorians, of course, this is a largely Victorian building, this part of the church. And on the walls, we have these stunning Victorian murals. They're really quite neon. There's something quite cartoonish about them, but they're in that pre-Raphaelite style, I guess that's why. It's more the Gothic sort of arch that surrounds them, the niche, that feels a bit cartoonish, but they really are decorative, sumptuous, floral, wonderful.
So then after leaving Monkton, I headed to my campsite just outside of Pembroke, where I stayed the night so I could have a rest day in Pembroke exploring the castle and its churches.
So you join me on my rest day here in Pembroke. and it's been a bit of a weird day. I've gone on a sort of mystery hunt for what has happened to all the churches here in Pembroke, as the main church, St Mary's, is closed, but that's not really too much of a mystery. It's probably just closed today because whoever opens it's not about. But the other churches at the other end of the high street, you've got the Wesleyan Chapel, and next to it another Anglican church, St Michael's, which is just seemingly going to ruin. You know, in the porch the tiles are falling off, the tracery in the window fenestrations is broken and leaning. There's ivy growing up parts of it. The gates, the beautiful brown metalwork gates, they're just gone to ruin. And I was like, when I saw this last night, I was like, what's going on? And then next to that is the Wesleyan Chapel, which is a beautiful sort of, sort of Renaissance-y, neoclassical building, obviously 19th century as well. St Michael's is a medieval church that was largely rebuilt in the 19th century too. But I was figuring out what is going on. So then I decided to go inside the town hall, where I got speaking to the old man who looks after the museum on the top floor. And we were just talking about churches, and I asked him, what is going on with St Michael's? And then he said this man bought it 10 years ago and just seems to be letting it go to ruin. And the Wesleyan Chapel, that one was sold privately off in the 1980s, was this sort of market emporium thing, and that failed and has just been a ruin for, I can't remember how long he said, probably 10 years or whatever. But anyway, back to the man. So apparently the man who owns St Michael's also owns St Daniel's, which is right on the top of the hill outside the town. So of course, naturally, I went and walked up there. And then I walk up there and it's actually really spooky. I was going to film there, but I got a bit scared. The vibe was very, these overgrown trees, all ivy over the graves. All the small windows that the church has were all boarded and bolted shut. And so it just gave me the heebie-jeebies, if you will. So I was like, I'm not filming down there. So I've come down here to film in the sort of, what is essentially the town fortifications. But no, so I went up to St Daniel's and I looked around. It doesn't seem to be in that bad of a condition structurally. The roof has all of its tiles. It seems to have been redone perhaps quite recently by the man who obviously owns it. The tower, however, is covered in ivy, which is surely doing great damage. But it does look, as you can see, very beautiful.
So unfortunately, I think this video is getting a little bit too long. So I'll upload the rest of my rest day at Pembroke Castle as a separate video entitled The History of Pembroke Castle, which should hopefully come out about next week. Then I will upload the penultimate episode of my Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage, in which we encounter the grisly side of medieval pilgrimage in the beautiful Church of St Mary's in Haverfordwest. And then on the following day, we encounter what I think might be my favourite part of the countryside I have witnessed on this journey, and also possibly my favourite church, or my favourite Friends of Friendless church, at least. So all of that to look forward to on the next episode.